for. So good morning. Thanks for having me at DevOps Days-Riga. It's my first trip to Riga, so this has been really great. I am Mandi Walls. I am currently the Technical Community Manager at Chef for EMEA. I've been at Chef almost 6 years, which is like 4 internet lifetimes, so it feels like forever. If you'd like to get in touch with me at any time, my email address is here. This is also my social media handle on everything but Snapchat, because I am way too old for that silliness. In addition to that, we have a community lead specifically for the project I'm going to talk about today. So I'm going to talk about InSpec, and my colleague, Adam Leff, is our internal representative for this project, who is sort of the dude who has his job priority is to help folks like you deal with questions and things you might have about this particular project. So that's his information there. So we are Chef. As we talked to some of you yesterday in the sponsor area, most of you know who we are, what we do. We started out configuration management, and over the course of the last 7 or 8 years or so, working with customers of all sizes, helping them out with configuration management, we've learned a lot about how technical organizations function or dysfunction, right, depending on how things go, and some of the stuff that they're doing, and sort of the latest movement in digital transformation and all those kinds of things. So what we've learned, especially in the last couple of years, is that every business is becoming a software business. So things are moving, right? So in 2003, there was this article in HBR, Harvard Business Review, which is like the business Bible in the United States, that was like, forget IT, outsource everything, no one cares, you don't have to be able to do any of this stuff. And we've come 180 degrees from that. You really want to be able to do as much technology work for yourself as you can. So one of our customers is Alaska Airlines, and they're kind of our hometown heroes. So Chef is based in Seattle, Alaska Airlines also based in Seattle, and they're really a regional carrier in the US, but they're very known for their customer service and some of their innovation and things like that. So their CIO visited our conference last year, and he's basically saying, we're going to be a software company with airplanes, right? So yeah, they spend millions of dollars on airplanes and all this capital expense for the things that go into running an airline, but the pieces that affect their customer service and their reputation and the way they make people happy comes out of software and technology. And it was a very interesting story. It's actually on our YouTube channel if you're interested in watching that. So Chef has moved on a bit from just configuration management and into sort of other things that we see people struggling with. And InSpec is one of the things that we've sort of put together to help with some of this stuff. So in security land, like my history, I was a sysadmin for a long time, so I'd be, kind of working with the engineering team, and they'd be like, all right, well, here's what we've got planned, here's the things we need, and be like, all right, what network connections, where do you think you're gonna go with all this stuff? And they're like, oh, we've got this database over here, and you'd be like, I'll put in the request, and we hope we'll get done by time for launch, and all these other things that happen. And you get a lot of places where there's a lot of product ideas, there's a lot of features people want, and everything kind of backs up into a security review, and the security team might say, okay, we'll let you do what you want to do with that, or they might say, no, sorry, we're not really permitted to let you do that, whether it's regulation or because of the way the network is set up, or any number of other things that sort of grind people to a halt. So we have this huge reservoir of interesting ideas and things you could be doing, and just a trickle of things that end up coming out the other side. And there's a reason for this. It's in the news almost every week. So going back to almost a year ago, HIPAA, H-I-P-A-A in the United States, is healthcare information policy, and there was a breach, right? And the initial problem was they failed to change the default settings when installing a new server. And I'm like, we're configuration management. We know how to deal with that kind of stuff, right? We know how to change the default settings on a server, but these have real financial outcomes for companies. And looking at looking forward into GDPR and some of the other things that are coming in Europe, we know this is going to be an issue. We're also looking at things like WannaCry, right? So this came in waves. folks were sort of initially affected by it, and then this story, particularly about Honda, was they had already fixed a lot of their stuff and then launched something new and realized that the things that they were putting back into production hadn't had their fixes backported, right? So you're not having a full life cycle of the security fixes that you're trying to create. And then finally, Equifax. I'd like to thank Equifax for putting my information out on the internet. It's fantastic. Dealing with a problem that was disclosed in March and not necessarily keeping up with all the things that are going in. So the project I'm going to talk to you about is InSpec, and we hope to help address a number of the different aspects of the problems that arise from these breaches and security settings and like keeping all of this stuff together. So as we're talking with some of our customers, we know we've got like a compliance office, especially if you deal with customer information, if you deal with credit card processing, you deal with any kind of like government information, you have like these folks that have big binders of information and checklists and all this stuff. And then we have maybe our security team, and these guys are even weirder than the sysadmins, right? And they're off in their own little worlds, and they follow CVEs, and they're reloading the cert page and like know what's going on with all that stuff. And then we have our DevOps or operations folks, and they have their own set of tools, their own set of information, and their own information flows from their vendors. And what we're really looking for is a way to combine all of the things that these people need into one place where we don't have a set it and forget it workflow where just hope you spout it out one time and it lasts forever. Something that we can actively manage and maintain over time so that our live running systems have security as part of their life. So normally I go through a bunch of slides here, but what I'm actually going to do is just give you the demo part so we get to the fun stuff first, right? So the tool that I'm working with this morning is called Test Kitchen. And talking to a few of you yesterday, some of you are sort of familiar with Test Kitchen, and some folks weren't. So Test Kitchen is another one of our open source projects, and it was sort of built by our community originally to help manage local development with virtual machines. So I'm on a Mac. I have VirtualBox and Vagrant under the hood here, and I'm running a CentOS 7.2 machine on top of my Mac workstation that I can test on. So one of the things Test Kitchen allows me to do is deal with configuration management tools and also testing tools. So it gives me a local workflow. I can say, all right, I have my code, I run it through a syntax checker or whatever, quick stuff, and then if that passes, I can also run it through a bunch of local tests. And for the piece that I'm using today with InSpec, I have here on the bottom a set of Linux baselines that were created by part of the InSpec team as something that they publish that's free to download and use. I don't actually have to think about this myself. I can say what they think is appropriate is what I'm going to pull in. I'll also talk about the ability to create your own profiles in a minute, but this is just something I'm going to consume as a user. And as you're working with a full team and you have your own workflows, this is another sort of component that you can do. Your security team, your compliance team can work on these profiles, publish them, and they can be consumed by your ops team, your engineering teams as part of their workflow. So it just kind of builds itself in. So what I have here, I've got my CentOS machine. All I've done is booted it up, and I've added some basic stuff to it that I needed just to log in and deal with that. And now I'm going to be able to run these tests against it to see where it is. It's a bare bones system. I maybe haven't updated it in a while. It's just been sitting on the base box. It's just been sitting on my laptop. So I'm going to use Kitchen to help me take a look at this machine and see how evil and bad it might be as far as sort of these tests go. So a couple of warnings, whatever. And then, so much red. Oh my goodness. This is just a machine, right? It's a basic install that is not sort of up to maybe this basic Linux security profile. That's not uncommon, right? Like I've been using Linux a long time. Like the stuff that gets into the distro is maybe the best practice from a couple of years ago. Things have changed, things have moved on, there's been some different recommendations, or certain distributions allow things to be kind of open, where maybe you want things to be more closed, right? So basic installation has a lot of things in it that might be suspicious. And we finally learned that we don't need TFTP and a couple of other things, so that comes up green the first time. And other stuff comes up red. And these components are all defined in a language that is, we hope, human readable. It's built off of sort of the RSpec testing component. So Chef and our sort of ecosystem is largely built off of Ruby. So we have a couple of other tools that were sort of derived from RSpec, which is Ruby testing tool. InSpec follows sort of the same pattern. I have this ability to create a control, so a thing that I'm going to test and make sure meets my security mandate, and I can make it hopefully as human readable as possible. So for something like my Etsy shadow file, right? So basic stuff, right? I want to make sure that it's there. I want to make sure that I'm after 1998 or whatever Linux started using Etsy shadow. But I have a file. It needs to be a regular file and not a link or a pipe or something else weird. It should be owned by a particular account. It has a group setting. It shouldn't be executable. All of these sorts of things that I can be very, very specific about the settings I need on my system. Now, you're probably looking at this and being like, what the hell? Like, seriously, most of this stuff is like this by default. But at the same time, when you're looking at the hundreds and hundreds of pages of a security spec, especially one that was created by a government agency, they're very specific about these things. And this tool, we want to help not worry about the hundreds and hundreds of pages, because I now have 15 lines of human readable and human shareable code to deal with all those things. So it gives me this ability to really create a huge, potentially huge set of really comprehensive tests and checks against my full system. And this happens to just be one that's sort of generic Linux baseline. And we have a couple of others that are sort of derived off of other specifications. So especially in North America, we have security definitions that are sort of proposed by various industry and government agencies. And you can sort of pick and choose which ones you like. And there's functionality in the tooling to say, give me certain ones of these and not others. So it can be very customized and tailored to the things that you need. So on my machine, my sort of basic, just downloaded off of the internet VirtualBox image, Vagrant image, comes up with, it's about a third of it failing, so sort of basic stuff that I might want to remedy. So kicking back into the things that Test Kitchen can do for you, I'm also going to use it with configuration management, in this case, Chef. That's not the only tool it supports, but I'm going to make my workflow sort of test and repair with the InSpec tooling. So I have a companion piece called hardening that is going to allow me to sort of match up all the tests that failed and fix all the things on this machine that didn't meet my needs. So we're going to let that run and see how that goes. Okay, there it is. And this is another component that I don't have necessarily on my machine. It's something that the tooling is going to download for me, so that as my security folks, my compliance folks are building these tools for all of my teams, they can share them out, put them on GitHub, wherever else they need to go, internally maybe, so that my engineering teams, my application development teams can just consume them and don't have to worry about them. But at the same time, as they're making changes to the systems to meet the needs of their applications, the security profile is there to say, you can't open this port, we don't allow that. You can't reach out to this machine. We don't allow that. You can't change the permissions on this particular file. We don't allow that. And you're catching that immediately in the local development cycle before things even get off this developer's laptop and into source code control that can be shared and passed around so that it's still always in line with your security profile. So I've made a bunch of changes based on my hardening profile, right? And then we're going to run our tests again and see how close we got. They worked yesterday, but in the world of open source, some busy bee may have been working last night, so we'll see. There we go. So we have all my tests have passed in this particular set of controls that I've chosen. I don't have any failures. So we'll flip back to the slides. We'll skip through a couple of these because we've already talked about it. Okay, let's go there. So one of the strengths of InSpec is that you can incorporate it with Test Kitchen. You can also use it on the command line. So if you want to find InSpec, it's at inspec.io. Everything I'm talking about today is open source, so it's free to download. You can access it at any time. There are commercial components to it, and I'm happy to talk about that at our table later. So what it looks like, we have the ability to describe a particular control, a thing that I want to look at, a resource on the system that should meet my security or compliance requirements. In this case, sort of our example is sshd_config, and I can run this system, this tooling, on a number of different distributions. And one of the good things that it'll do for me is abstract away where that file lives. I know it's sshd_config, that's what it's going to be called, but I don't necessarily need to care or know where it's going to be on Debian versus CentOS versus Fedora versus whatever else I might be running. The abstraction layer that comes with InSpec finds all that stuff for you, which makes it a lot easier to share with application engineering teams and other folks that may not necessarily be up on where your distro is putting all your files. Everything is an impact, so that I can say, this is an incredibly important thing. My security team absolutely requires this. If this wasn't met, I would have to take the machine offline, etc., whatever it might be. They are from 0 to 1.0, so this one in particular has been chosen to be of the utmost importance. And, but you can kind of rate them and say, oh, well, the permissions on this group aren't a death sentence for this machine necessarily, but it should be checked. And then it has a title and some description that oftentimes is just copied right out of the security profile. So out of those hundreds of pages of PDF file, there's lots of discussion about what the control should be, what it should look like, what's the theory behind changing this particular setting. And we can actually just paste that stuff right into our control so it matches up, and our auditor can go through the code and say, oh yeah, this matches what I see on my printout, checkbox, you're good to go. Then finally I have the thing that I want to match. In this case, my security team has said all of our SSH daemons should only run protocol 2. Hooray, that's great. Most of our stuff's going to be set up that way anyway, but there might be things that sneak through. But we want to check it as often as possible, so we'll put it into our control. So we're going to just compare the protocol setting in the file to the value of 2. So the resources in particular are built in for a lot of common services, system files, common configurations, so you don't have to go back through and find things and write parsers and redefine and all that kind of stuff. And there's a whole big list of them, and they're sort of constantly being added to there. There's also a bunch of stuff for Windows specifics. If you work in a Windows platform, you want to make sure your registry key is set in a certain value, or you have other ACLs and things on the files. Those are set for sort of Windows specifics. So the resource has all these characteristics, and you'll find as you start to dig into some of them that are specifically for testing values in files, that it will parse the file and dig around and give you sort of a list you can sort of check against of the different values that are present in that file. So we talked about most of that stuff. So it takes out the sort of grepping for X part of your testing phase, right? So your security team comes through and they're looking at your machines. They're like, all right, we'll find this file, find this value, and all these things. We can run this profile and say everything came back okay. And then all the parsers and the pieces on the InSpec software do all that sort of work for you. There's lots of matchers for things that you might want to test, right? So thinking back to the security profiles, there's a lot of things in there that get very, very specific. And you want to be able to match those as much as possible so you can just sort of pass these off. Things like files and directories should exist, packages that should be installed or maybe shouldn't be installed, services that should or should not be enabled, things like NFS or Telnet or TFTP or any other horrible things that we've sort of buried in our history. Also, sort of specific things like how long do you retain logs on the local machine? Like that's a setting that you can sort of check for. Exit status for a particular test. If you get a security test from your upstream vendor that says run this to check for this vulnerability, you can actually add that to your profile and say, I got a good return from that particular script from my vendor, and I can keep that as part of my tests. So running it, we looked at it in Test Kitchen, so it's all local for that particular piece, but you can also run it remotely on systems. So it's a command line tool in that way, and you can install it as a Ruby gem or as part of our toolkit. So it just kind of comes along when you install the Chef Developer Toolkit. You can run it locally, test the machine that you're working on, right? So my local workstation or whatever I happen to be playing with, and that's fine. Or remotely against a target. So, and then finally there's a REPL shell, which is super interesting to sort of dig into if you're really into sort of stepping through these piece by piece. But testing any target's kind of the interesting piece, right? So if I want to run it locally, I just inspec exec and then the profile file or the test file that I want to look at. If I am testing a remote Linux system and I have all my profiles local on my machine and I want to test the remote system, it follows sort of the SSH conventions, so -I for my identity, and I just give it the testing files that I want to test against. So it's kind of like Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, though. Like, if you're testing something, I don't want to alter necessarily the machine that I'm testing. I want to get a look at it as it actually exists. So what InSpec will do is it's not altering the target system. It's using the pieces that I have locally and executing them remotely against the machine. And that's a whole other set of craziness going on in the background. But it allows me to say, this is the way the machine exists, not necessarily this is the way the machine exists in the testing capacity, right? So it's not a testing environment, it's actually the tool reaching out to the system, but not altering it. If I want to do it on WinRM for a Windows machine, I can do that. And finally, I can actually dig around in my Docker containers if I want to with those as well. You can incorporate it then into build systems because it uses the sort of predictable Unix return codes, right? So if I have any failures, I get a non-zero return code, which I can then read the build and put the hat on and then go fix it or whatever. If everything passes, I get a 0 return code and I can progress in my workflow. So in that way, it's super handy to incorporate these and constantly check things as your systems are changing, especially it's very quick, right? It doesn't take a long time to run a lot of these profiles, so it gives you a really good, at least initial check for all your security profiles. We already talked about Test Kitchen because that's the fun stuff. That's what the code then sort of more looks like in sort of bigger print to give you an idea. It runs under the verifier settings in Test Kitchen. Over time, as your team works together and figures out how you want to test things and how they should live, you can build up what we call InSpec profiles. So it allows you to package up and share sets of tests, right? And again, this is all part of the open source support stuff, so it's all there available for you. Each profile can have a whole bunch of test files included, and each test file can have multiple tests inside it. So you can actually have a fairly robust set of tests and checks without going super wild on numbers of files and different profiles. So usually the test files have like sort of one required outcome per file, but if we look at what's in the there we go. The one that I have up from our Linux friends, they have just a couple of controls files in here for parts of the system. So operating system level controls, controls about packages, and then something very specific for sysctl, because it's crazy town in there and you want to sort of keep it separate. So you can sort of logically sort of combine them together so that they make more sense, and maybe you have different people that are maybe responsible for different components, and it helps with the sharing of those things and creation of these profiles. Then on top of that, they're super flexible. You can create your own profiles for your specific software. Like I mentioned earlier, we have a bunch for sort of generic operating systems, but you can also build them for middleware applications and anything else that you might be interested in. So thinking about, is your JMX port open to the world, or any other sort of thing that you might have in your other layers. So that's a little bit about the demo that I already fired up. So we will click through those parts. So we already saw the cool stuff. So yeah, over time, the tool gives you the ability to sort of build a comprehensive set of checks for all of your systems, whether you have a specific team that is responsible for security and compliance or not. Then there's also a bunch of examples and sort of starting places available in the InSpec team's GitHub repositories to give you a place to start if you're just like, oh my God, these are crazy. If you've ever downloaded the CIS standard, you know it's like 400 pages of PDF. It's gigantic, it's ridiculous. So there's interesting places to start with some of those tools that are already available. You want to be able to run stuff every time someone needs to make a change. You don't want to get stuck saying, did we update that image? Like, we're going to build a bunch of systems tomorrow for this new release. Did we update it for all the security problems or not? You'll be able to check all these things on a regular basis. You don't want to get stuck 6 weeks from now saying, oh, I have to turn this all off because we weren't paying attention, we didn't patch all these things. And hopefully we make it easy for everyone to use. Like, it is very human readable, right? And very accessible for lots of different folks on your team. Because we know that in some respects, your compliance folks may not be deep into the intricacies of what's going on in your command line or parsing different variables or whatever, but they can certainly read through what's going on in these profiles and be part of the solution for your team. So some resources for this particular project, as I mentioned earlier, it's inspec.io. We have a bunch of training available and workshops and other things that are on our GitHub repository. There's a couple of folks in our community that have written up their experiences with InSpec. So one of them that I really like is Annie Hedgepeth. She basically wanted to get back into tech after doing something else for a while, and wrote up a bunch of blog posts about her experiences learning InSpec as a way of getting into technology as a career. And super interesting, and she now works for one of our partners as a consultant. And there's some other stuff that's coming to InSpec, like the ability to talk to your cloud providers, make sure that your systems are running the right AMI, right, on Amazon. So somebody launches something for your environment, you want to make sure they're using the right components, the right security groups, the right IAM settings. You can check those with InSpec. Those things are still under development, but there's a few things there. If you'd like the GitHub repository for the demo that I gave, that's right there. It gives you couple minutes of getting started with Test Kitchen if you've never looked at it before. Could be a very interesting tool for your workflow. And then finally, thank you for being here this morning. We actually have our own event in London coming up. We'd love to see anybody there. We have some folks coming in to talk more about InSpec and some of the things that we're doing with that, as well as some of our other projects. So, just now to 0.
Yeah, unfortunately a bit over time, but regardless, thank you, Mandi. Here's a little gift from us.
Super cool.
I think Mandi is one of the furthest visitors. You're from Texas, right?
No, I cheated. I live in London right now.
Oh,
wow.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mandi. While